check.
What's up everyone, my name is Triple A and welcome to Game Off Mass Effect 2 Edition, the game that has so many possible romances and sexy fun times, it could just as easily be called Ass Effect 2. It's not funny. Before I jump headfirst into this video, I have a confession to make. I didn't really start Game Off very well. I mean, don't get me wrong, for my first couple videos, that was pretty good, but I had no hard numbers to back anything up. It was literally just me saying things and arbitrarily placing certain games above others. Since then, I've created a scoring system for Under the Influence and released a franchise edition of Game Off that also had a scoring system. And as I make videos for my vacation, I've been implementing different ones for my developer and character editions as well. So it's about damn time I made one for the classic Game Off as well, so here goes. I had the idea in my developer video to make Metacritic scores and user scores part of the overall scoring system, and while I weighted that pretty heavily since Metacritic scores, while not perfect, have a good estimate of the public's response to games, and with developers you have a larger sample size, so even if some of the scores are not entirely reflective of how the game was actually received, the greater sample size means the regression of the mean disappears to some extent, and you're left with a good idea of what the overall score should be. But with just a single game as your sample size, it probably wouldn't be a smart move to give this too much weight. Still, who am I to make all of these decisions myself? The fans and critics should have some say at least, so the Metacritic score will account for 25 points of the total Game Off score, and that's after we average the critic and user scores. As for the rest of the 75 points, story will account for 20 of those, with plot being 15 of that, and characters and interactions being worth 5. Voice acting will be graded out of 5 points, and our biggest category, which is gameplay, is worth 25 points, split evenly for gameplay mechanics and actual fun factor. Visuals, art, and music combined are all worth 5 points, and both innovation and identity are worth 10 each. And just to refresh, the identity category means how unique this game is, and how much it differs from other titles out there, either with unique game modes or emphasis on untapped gaming reservoirs, etc. As a disclaimer with this scoring system, since not every game tries to tick off these boxes, some of these categories will be void from their scoring. For example, going back and looking at Shadow of the Colossus, I'd say voice acting isn't really something that's quintessential to the title, so I just kind of left it out since I couldn't decide what to give it anyways. And so instead of being out of 75 points, excluding Metacritic scores, it was out of 70, and the number I got for it was just multiplied by 75 over 70 in order to make it fair. Also, some games have notoriously questionable Metacritic scores, like how Breath of the Wild has a 97 critic score and an 8.4 user score. And since I thought that clear differential had to do with some sort of corrupt review system from one side or the other, I decided to cut the Metacritic aspect of that scoring altogether and just give it a grade out of 75, which I then multiplied by 4 out of 3 to get it out of 100, and that was the score for it. At this point, I guess I should just say what the scores were for the original 3 games that I've already done, and let me just say, let this be a lesson to everyone to not always trust what you see on the internet, because I totally butchered the original list. Remember when I said in my Breath of the Wild episode about how it fairly easily moved past Shadow of the Colossus and was essentially tied with The Last of Us and I couldn't really decide between the two? Yeah, oops. Turns out Shadow of the Colossus received a 22.75 out of the 25 for Metacritic user and critic scores, and then my in-depth analysis left me with 75 out of 70 for my portion, which, like I said, multiplied by 75 over 70 and then added to the Metacritic score, gave us a grand total of 92.39. The Last of Us did fare a bit better, receiving a 23.375 and a 71 out of 75 for Metacritic and Game Off scores respectively, and that left it at a total of 94.375. And after being forced to ignore Metacritic for Breath of the Wild, it received a 69 out of 75 from me, and that multiplied by 4 over 3 gives it a 92, and that actually leaves it underneath Shadow of the Colossus at 3rd place. Don't get me wrong, it's still a wonderful game, but when broken down, it maybe isn't quite at the 97 it got on Metacritic in my opinion. It's a weird case where there aren't many flaws, but it doesn't absolutely knock everything out of the park. For example, story, character, voice acting kind of stuff, that may have been good and not problematic at all, but they weren't quite tier 1, which hurts it a little bit. But regardless, these scripts are supposed to be like 3 pages long, and I'm already through a page and I've only said the words Mass Effect once. So let's stop dilly-dallying with the past and get into what this actual whole episode is about. Mass Effect 2 is one of those games that I know is good. I know it's good. I do, but I never really got into it. It's just like how I love Lord of the Rings and all of its lore and the writing style and the movies, but for some reason my brain would always tap out halfway through reading Fellowship of the Ring every single time, and I just couldn't get past it. Or how it took me 4 tries to force myself to watch episode 1 of The Office and not just get bored 10 minutes in. And what would you know, on the 4th time when I really tried and watched a few episodes, I all of a sudden got so addicted that I finished the whole show in 2 weeks. Same thing applies here. I've played maybe 10 hours of Mass Effect 2, and then I lost interest and took a break from it, and then came back to it a couple months later, started from the beginning, played about 10 hours again, and still couldn't get into it. It's not that it's flawed, and I'm not saying that by any stretch of the imagination that it is a bad game, but that's just how things go for me sometimes with games. It just wasn't really my cup of tea, but objectively I still think I can cover it very fairly, so let's see how Commander Shepard fares against our previous 3 juggernauts. Mass Effect 2 has 3 different review clumps on Metacritic. One for the Xbox 360 version, one for the PS3, and one for the PC. And they all have slightly different review scores, although they're all fairly close, so it's not like there's some massive gaps in between. And the user scores stay in the same-ish range as each other, and aren't astronomically different from the critic reviews. The farthest is the PS3 user scores, which differs from the critic scores by 9 points, but I still thought it was fair game, and I averaged all 6 of these scores out to reach a final average of 91, which is a very respectable score and gives it the same score as Shadow of the Colossus in this category, with a 22.75 out of 25. With this very solid base, let's look a bit more in depth and see how it holds up in each individual category. Story is up first, and let me make it clear that the story aspect of this game did not lose my attention. In fact, after the second time I tried and failed to play the game all the way through, I still went around and found some of the versions of how the game plays out just so I could feed my curiosity. The story was really good and engaging. It starts with one of the greatest opening scenes I've ever seen in a video game, and right off the bat makes you feel both shocked and intrigued, while also allowing the game to use it as a bit of a soft reset on your previous progress in the first Mass Effect game if you played that, so it can either be played standalone if you haven't played the previous game, or it can make sure returning players aren't overpowered when playing this game, and they don't have way too many things that would make the game way too easy. It's a pretty smart tactic, and one that is done really cleverly so it doesn't actually feel out of place in the actual narrative of the game. On top of that, it also hides some interesting character development in subtle moments, and it just all comes together in a really cool, intuitive, fun to watch introduction to the game. From there, you're resurrected 2 years later because you might be of use to a group called Cerberus and a dude called the Elusive Man. Then you go out, find a squad, do some missions, have an interesting relationship with the Elusive Man that can change up depending on the choices you make, and you go about trying to protect humanity from the Reapers, who are out there trying to attack and capture all kinds of species. The base story is really interesting and has some very engaging cutscenes, and even as a linear story it would have been really good, but the added ability to say and do what you choose to do, and those choices being pretty diverse, and even some smaller things that you do have larger impacts later on, and the story can really change up when you try different playstyles, that all really lends to the replayability of the game. Not to mention the options that are given in the dialogue wheel for each situation all work and are indicative of what you will actually say and do. And while that seems like a no-brainer, when Fallout 4 was released 6 years after this game, its dialogue wheel was not very good at all, and at some point seems like it was just messing around with you and you'd feel cheated out of your decision. So the fact that Mass Effect 2 does this was actually a big deal. If we were to look at the trilogy as a whole, I might have taken some points off due to the fact that Mass Effect 3 had an infamous ending that only saw 2 real endings that were almost the exact same no matter what giant choices you made. As a standalone game, the story in Mass Effect 2 is well done and well written and doesn't have that problem. Out of the 20 points allocated for story, plot takes up 15 of those, and a 15 out of 15 is an elite story. Games that have ever existed. The story truly needs to be groundbreaking and unflinchingly amazing. Is that the case with Mass Effect? Well, almost. There aren't really any flaws here. The story is told well, and it's a great story in general, and all the choices you make just deepen it, but I don't think it's an all-time elite story. The Last of Us so far is the only game I've given a 15 in this department because the story was so good that leaving it to go to sleep or something was a legitimate struggle. As amazing as Mass Effect's story was, it didn't give me that same feeling, and I think it was missing an X factor that could have really put it over the edge. Oh, and the story and twist in the first Mass Effect is a little bit better, so as it is, I'll easily give it the 14 out of 15 that it deserves for plot, And as for characters, this one is a lot easier. I mean, they not only introduce a massive cast of characters that have different personalities, but it also allows you to develop your own relationships with each one. Not to mention, these relationships and loyalties have huge impacts on the future of the game. Again, even as a linear thing, this category would have probably easily been a 5, but with the amount that you can change things up, even down to Shepard's own attitude, this category receives the easiest 5 out of 5 I can give, which means Shepard and his squad receive an amazing score of 19 out of 20 from the story side of things. Voice acting. Lots of characters, lots of dialogue, talented voice actors that improved from the first game. 5 out of 5. Done. Getting into gameplay, which is worth 25, and that's split into 2 even 12.5 points each, which encompass actual mechanics of the gameplay and fun factor, respectively. In terms of actual mechanics, a part of this game is basic third-person shooting that is done pretty well, and it's very sound and it works exactly how it's supposed to. And on top of that, you have a large set of powers and ways to upgrade things that add a fun flair to the game. You also have the ability to go around to different planets, recruit squad members, there's strategizing here, and a bunch of other kind of big but kind of smaller parts of the gameplay that are intuitively done and well executed, and I can't find much wrong with it. And if you're wondering at this point why I didn't enjoy the game with all of its great qualities, like I said, I thought it was an amazing game. I just have trouble with some games that involve strategy or any kind of real thought. Not because I'm an idiot. Well, I mean, that's debatable. But because when I'm playing video games, I want to have fun and experience something. Managing your squad and your abilities here is just not appealing to me, nor is something like XCOM, which is a serious strategy game. So while I see the appeal, it doesn't really entice me personally. Still, the wide array of things here are really well executed and nothing feels wrong, at least in terms of my experience and when I did research on the game for this episode. And for those sound mechanics both in combat and in your choices, which I do consider to be part of the gameplay, Mass Effect 2 receives full marks for the gameplay mechanics section. Moving on to fun factor, and while the third-person combat I was talking about earlier is sound and does work well, it wasn't as enjoyable as it could have been. And personally, gunfights seem to me to not have the same amount of entertainment value as a lot of other games. Hell, even the newest Mass Effect game, Andromeda, while being significantly worse than this game in a lot of ways, definitely has better combat than the original trilogy, and fully realizes how fun Mass Effect's combat can be. So Mass Effect 2 falls a little bit flat there. For me personally, again, the managing side of things wasn't all too enjoyable, but that's just a personal preference. I understand there's actually nothing fundamentally wrong with it, and it's actually really fun, so don't worry, I'm not taking any points off there. And finally, the dialogue choices can be really fun, and while yeah, it wasn't entirely perfect, and a few people here and there would say they would have preferred something slightly different, overall it was a very good system that was fun to use. Of the 12.5 points, however, I think the slightly lackluster combat knocks the game down a couple of pegs to a 10.5, which gives it an overall gameplay score of 23 out of 25. Pretty much everything about this game is great, except for the combat being a little bit lacking. In terms of visuals, art, and music, this game is not bad by any means, and in some areas it's fairly impressive. However, our previous 3 competitors, The Last of Us, Shadow of the Colossus, and Breath of the Wild, all have some pretty mind-blowing visuals, incredible music, save for maybe Breath of the Wild, and insane art direction. And compared to those, Mass Effect really doesn't compete. It's really good, but again, not elite, especially in terms of art direction, since the visuals and music are actually still very good. But while it looks pretty, it's not quite at the highest level, fitting very comfortably in a tier 2 spot here, which earns it a 4 out of 5 for this category. Our second last category is innovation, and after Mass Effect 1 stepped out of the gate and delivered such an impressive and all-around experience with a great story, wonderful mechanics for dialogue choices, and the unique quality of feeling massive and yet personal at the same time, it cemented itself as a game that was way ahead of the curve, and a force to be reckoned with. Mass Effect 2 took that base and improved on it in every way, aside from the very slightly weaker story. And in terms of innovation, that means it had a very innovative first entry, and it was all made better in the second, so it's easily a high point earner here. Mass Effect really excels at the choose-your-own-story aspect of gaming, while also being very combat-based, unlike, say, a Telltale game, and also makes Commander Shepard feel very unique to you. As an RPG alone, this game makes huge strides. It was just very intuitive with everything it tried to do, and while it lacked in some areas, as a whole it did very well in raising the bar for RPG gaming. It's maybe not quite the level of Shadow of the Colossus here, but almost. I'd say it earns a 9.5 out of 10 here, which blows a couple of our past competitors out of the water. And finally we have Identity. I'd liken Mass Effect to Star Wars in many ways, not just because you go out and explore space, but it also has so many memorable characters and epic plot lines full of twists and turns, and it just all seems like gaming's equivalent to that massively popular movie franchise. It has a large cast of alien races, and it perfects the action RPG formula in most areas. And how could I forget to mention the romances you can build that encompass straight, biracial, bispecies, and bisexual relations. There's just a lot that sets this game apart from the crowd. When you see it, you can tell that it's Mass Effect. However, it's not entirely unique. It does perfect so many systems, but as for the amount of truly new and unique stuff that it brings to the table, it's not quite on the same level as some other games out there. Overall, I think again it deserves a very high yet still not perfect 9.5 out of 10. Tallying everything up gives us a grand total of 70 out of 75 from my side, which, when paired with the Metacritic score, gives us, drumroll please, wait, we couldn't afford a drumroll? Okay, what can we do? Sure. The scores combined give us a total of... Oh, shut up! Thank you. The scores combined give us a total of 92.75, which is barely enough to land it over Shadow of the Colossus and leave it in the second place position just behind The Last of Us. This is an incredible score considering how many facets there are in the scoring system, and I think even though Mass Effect isn't my game, it still deserves the number 2 spot. What do you guys think? Is this way too high on the list, or exactly where you thought it would be? Maybe you think it should be above The Last of Us. Let me know in the comments below, and also tell me what you guys want to see next. In the meantime, be sure to like, share, and subscribe, and until next time, this has been AAA, signing off.